that's your cake, right? So yeah, so I do fully believe that it's a good idea to look at other people's art. There's this, definitely some controversy among certain people who believe that it's a bad idea to look at other people's photography or that you should somehow wall yourself off. Otherwise, you're just going to slavishly copy everyone. And I strongly disagree with this notion because all art is as I said, a giant exercise of collaboration, of riffing off of what's come before and taking it in your own direction in a way that is never wholly new. And you also we see so much on a daily basis that we can't unsee, And so it's much better to just feed the brain than try to starve it, and try because then you can say that anything you came up with was all yours, I really feel that that's where that is coming from, is this deep desire to say, "No, I didn't just see it, that was me, it came completely from me." But if you just let go of that and just realize that the fun of it is actually that we're all kind of just sort of exploring the visual arts together, it's a lot healthier. A child from the age of whenever they can kind of open their eyes and process imagery is bombarded with it, especially in this day and age. 2D, 3D, that there have been studies done that the average very small child can now produce artwork that's much more sophisticated than adults could have done in Lascaux or, in the cave painting era, right? Because they have seen and processed already by the age of 2, so much visual material that has been turned into two-dimensional form or whatever. And so it's just, I don't think, a very healthy idea that, you should starve yourself of inspiration and also the whole thing with copying is you're choosing what you want to copy because why?
Yeah.
Because you liked it, right? And that tells you something about yourself. You liked that, right? I mean, it's different than if you're on a commercial job and someone says, "I need something that looks like X." That's a little different. You still do learn something though, at least from trying to ape the style of something where maybe it's dictated to you. But we're talking about creativity and not so much the commercial process. But yeah, so, I really appreciate where you were going there with the idea of copying.
It's an interesting thing. So there's two things to unpick, or there's actually a number of things to unpick. But let's start with this. So the thing about commercial um, contracts, let's call them, is that I know from my own experience that very often I'm forced to do research into certain things because I have very specific client requests, and that of course helps me to grow and learn. You know, um, the reality is, I think in an ideal world, we'd all love it if you get a phone call and somebody goes like, "Oh, I want to hire you for your style because we love it. Please, enlighten us with your art." That virtually never happens. It's usually, in my case anyway, some company calls me up and goes like, "Oh, we need, promotional images for X. Can you do
Yeah.
it? And here is what our art department or what our, marketing department needs." And then it's like, "Sure, I can do it 100%." And then I'm like on the computer going, "How do you do this?" You know, and of course I have to do a degree of research in order to 100% match what the client wants, and what I need to deliver. That also means that I'm adding, um, ammunition to my own armory, whatever you want to call it. At the next time round, I have another tool that I can deploy.
So, talk that I did for years on composition included a bit where, I showed some old textbooks on landscape photography, the earliest one that I could find from the 19th century. And, they had such strict ideas about what worked and what didn't work because at the time, all they knew was architectural photography, right? Back then, they had just graduated from the pinhole cameras, basically, where you needed a 10-hour exposure or whatever. And what they were photographing were things that didn't move. And so that tended to be city scenes with buildings in them because buildings don't move. So you have all of these old photos where there are no people because the exposures were so long they couldn't pick up the people. And what they learned from that is that, wow, because architecture tends to be very symmetrical, and so do city streets for that matter, that it was possible to take a very static image. And so all these rules about composition were developed out of that era that just don't apply to the more organic forms that you find in nature. So you have in nature a delightful situation when you can find absolute symmetry, or when you can center something in a frame and make it work with the balance. That delights the eye. But this is more of an acquired vision, similar to what you're saying with people getting used to hearing more sounds in music. The more that we see how that works in nature, that, oh yeah, that actually can work really well. Not everything has to be counterbalance, especially in nature when there's just it's almost impossible to find absolute perfect symmetry in nature like you would in architecture. And so it's interesting that so much landscape photography plays on concepts of centering that had no place at all in photography books that treated the topic, in the 19th century. So very similar.
It's likewise, it's interesting, to see old textbooks in, portrait photography, for example, and the relative I mean, I'd say that very and it's I'm making broad sweeping statements here. The relative simplicity, compared to a lot of the, more contemporary portrait work that I see, which is actually why I love going to the portrait gallery, over here in London, because it's a fantastic, inspirational journey, through the centuries in terms of
Yeah.
paintings. And there's just two galleries here in London, the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery, which are fantastic. Um, I would say learning grounds for any portrait photographer, in terms of lighting and so on and so forth. Um, do you think that developing your own style is something that is inevitable, or is it something that needs to be even desirable for every photographer?
Well, let's just back up a minute and define what we mean by that. I recently published an article in Wild Eye magazine on exactly this topic. And in that, I said that it's important to make the distinction between what we mean by style and what we mean by stylization.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip, then press here for the full episode in glorious Technicolor. Hey, and don't forget to subscribe.